Hello, everyone. The presentation will begin in just a few minutes. We're just going to give everyone another minute or two to join, and then we'll start. I'd like to welcome you to the Dash and Thompson Best Practices series. This is where we share some of our experiences around important topics that we think can benefit the L&D community, with the goal that you can take and apply it directly in your organization. I'm Connell Smith, CEO at Dash and Thompson, and today we are speaking on cognitive biases and their impact and use in learning. You will hear from Sarah Bougie, our Director of Business Development, and Andrea May, our VP of Instructional Design Services, and who is presenting today's topic. Thanks for joining us, and with that, I'll hand it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Connell. Welcome, everyone. Throughout the webinar presentation today, your individual phone lines will be on mute. So if you happen to have a question or something that you'd like to bring up, please submit it through the question and chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen on the GoToWebinar function. We'll have time at the end of the presentation today to answer the questions that come in, and we'll also follow up with you directly if we happen to miss anything or if we run out of time. Throughout the presentation today, we'll be having a series of 3 interactive poll questions. These questions will pop up right on your screen, and please participate by just selecting your answer. We'll also be recording the webinar today, and we'll be distributing it to all registrants at the end of the seminar. With that, I'll hand it over to Andrea.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. We're thrilled you've chosen to spend some time with us today to discuss how cognitive biases affect learning. This is a topic of special interest for me, and I'm excited to share what I've learned about it with you. So on our agenda today, we'll start by answering the question, what are cognitive biases? Then we'll spend actually most of our time today discussing how some cognitive biases can negatively impact learning and how you as a designer can overcome those biases by putting other biases to work for you in your training design. We'll have a few minutes at the end for Q&A, so please feel free to enter your questions at any time during the presentation. Let's go ahead and get started. Our brains receive nonstop input from all 5 senses every moment that we're awake. In the face of this enormous amount of daily input, our brains develop subconscious coping mechanisms that we can use to make decisions quickly. Every day we have a lot of decisions to make. Cognitive biases result when these coping mechanisms fail. Put simply, a cognitive bias is an error in the way we think. In 1986, it was calculated that the average person was taking in information equivalent to 40 85-page newspapers each day. That was back in 1986. By 2011, this had increased to 175 newspapers worth of information each day. You can be sure in 2018, that number is even higher. If we had to sort through all of the information we take in every day, just to make a simple decision about where to have dinner, for example, we might just starve in the process. So in order to cope with so much input, we develop subconscious mental shortcuts so we can make all the quick decisions needed to navigate our daily lives. These mental shortcuts are called heuristics. Heuristics are essentially the brain's way of automating repetitive tasks and decisions. For example, if you're familiar at all with manufacturing, you know that the best tasks and processes to automate are those that are either very consistent or those that are very low risk. There are rules in place that these automated systems follow, and as long as the rules are not broken, you'll have a positive outcome every time. But automated systems don't handle exceptions that well, exceptions that break the rules in particular. If someone loads the labels upside down in the labeling machine, you might end up with 1,200 jars with upside down labels before you even realize that there's a problem. The same is true for our brains. Exceptions can cause irrational errors in our decision-making process, causing our heuristics to lead us to failure. A cognitive bias results when a heuristic fails to deliver the correct decision. To reach a better understanding of the relationship between heuristics and cognitive biases, we're going to take 2 polls now. So in both of these polls, you'll be given a short list of personality traits describing a person you've never met. Then you'll be asked to use that information to make a judgment about their profession. let's take a look at our first poll.
Carol, seen here, is quiet, calm, intelligent, and helpful. From these characteristics, what profession do you consider her most likely to be? A librarian, a police officer, or a bartender? And we'll give you a couple seconds to answer here. And it looks like about 71% of you said librarian.
Yep, that's right. 71% said librarian. And you can all be rest assured that you're correct in this case. Carol is a librarian. Before we discuss that any further, let's take a look at poll number 2. Consider scenario 2.
Mary is loud, opinionated, intelligent, and self-sufficient. From these characteristics, what profession do you consider her most likely to be? A lawyer, an activist, or an elementary school teacher? All right, looks like we're pretty much a tie between a lawyer and an activist.
Activist is inching ahead just a little bit, 49%, with 42% as lawyer, and finally 9% was elementary school teacher. All right, so most of you, a small majority, at least 49%, answered activist in this situation. Mary actually is an elementary school teacher in this case. Only 9% of you chose that. That's probably because those characteristics about Mary don't really fit our idea of elementary school teacher. In answering those poll questions, we used a heuristic and a cognitive bias. In this case, it was the representativeness heuristic or bias. When we use the representativeness heuristic, we estimate the likelihood of an event or an outcome by comparing it to an existing prototype that already exists in our brains. In these cases, representativeness led us to 2 different outcomes, one correct and one incorrect. In that first poll, about 71% of you decided that Carol must be a librarian, which was correct in that case. Her characteristics of being quiet, calm, intelligent, and helpful fit well with our assumptions about librarians, much better than they fit with the professions of police officer or bartender. About 49% of you decided that Mary was an activist. That was incorrect. In reality, Mary is an elementary school teacher. In both cases, we really didn't have enough information to reliably make a judgment about profession. But since we were asked to make a judgment, we applied our rule of thumb, which led us to the correct assumption in one case and the incorrect assumption in the other. Our poll questions provided an example of one cognitive bias out of 188 that have been identified in psychology. Not all of these biases will impact learning, but we're going to focus on some that might. Next, we'll explore how cognitive biases impact learning. First, we'll identify 4 common goals of learning. Next, we'll look at some of the negative effects of cognitive biases and how to mitigate them. And finally, we'll discuss how to make our biases work for you and not against you. First, why should we care? Cognitive biases can be both useful and detrimental to learning. They matter to us because they can make learners and designers resistant to incorporating new information. They can result in learners remembering inaccurate information, or they can prevent learning from happening altogether. In my opinion, it's impossible for a person to become completely unbiased, and it probably would be counterproductive to do that. But in those cases, when biases keep us from considering new ideas and being open to learning, it's best to hold up a mirror to ourselves and to our learners so we can continue to grow and create effective learning experiences that are hopefully new and exciting for our learners. Generally speaking, any learning objective that you define can be classified under one of 4 learning goals. As instructional designers, we're seeking either behavior change, performance improvement, retention or recall, and finally, critical thinking or problem solving. For each of these learning goals, there are a number of biases that can negatively impact progress towards that goal. I've listed a few here for you to see, but for today, we'll discuss one negative bias for each goal and examine a scenario you might encounter in training. Then we'll discuss how triggering another bias might have a positive impact and mitigate the effects of the negative bias. First, let's look at an example of how cognitive biases can negatively and positively impact a learning goal that requires behavior change. So a few years ago, I was working with a manufacturing client who was implementing a new time reporting system in all of their warehouses and their manufacturing facilities. The company had already piloted the system in one of their locations, but the results of the pilot were surprising and not in a great way. While the new system proved to be exactly what was needed from a reporting and payroll perspective, they were surprised by the level of resistance they were seeing from the staff, the workers at the pilot location. The plant happened to be one of their oldest facilities, and a good portion of the staff there had been there since the very beginning and were now within a few years of retirement. They were not happy about having to change routines that they'd done for 30 years or more in some cases, and they certainly didn't want to learn how to use a new system. The status quo bias is defined as the tendency to want things to stay relatively the same. The plant workers saw changes coming and immediately started displaying resistance behaviors due to this bias. Because of this, it took much longer than the company had hoped to implement the system during the pilot, and they didn't want that experience to repeat itself at the other locations. So I was brought in with a small team to design a training and change management program to mitigate this problem at the remaining sites. After some meetings and interviews, we determined that it was the status quo bias that had been hard at work during the pilot. In order to counteract that bias at other locations, we chose to use the IKEA effect as one way to counteract maintaining the status quo. The IKEA effect is the tendency for people to place a disproportionately high value on things that they partially assembled themselves, such as furniture from IKEA, regardless of the quality of the end result. So to trigger this positive cognitive bias in our learners, we created an activity in which small groups created their own quick reference card and added to it throughout the course. Once the training at a location was completed, workers would vote on the best quick reference card out of all the small groups, and that card was then distributed to everyone at the location. The winners were given a small prize, and their card was entered into a final corporate level competition for best card. The program was well received, and the level of resistance at each location was significantly lower than it had been at the pilot location. This example illustrated how the status quo bias can be mitigated with the IKEA effect. Now let's move on to an example of how cognitive biases can influence performance improvement goals. There are some biases that undermine performance improvement goals, and there are other biases that can support these same performance improvement goals. Let's take a look at an example that illustrates this. A few years ago, we were brought in to assist with training design and development for a large university that was implementing PeopleSoft financials. The project included a complete overhaul of the university's chart of accounts. But the team working on that part of the project was already 4 months behind, and we were only 7 months into a 2-year project. The delay was caused by a lack of agreement and ongoing arguments among department representatives. I was asked to sit in on a couple of the team's working sessions in order to provide recommendations about how the team could start to build consensus and move the project forward. It was obvious after observing a session that the team was falling victim to Parkinson's law of triviality, which is the tendency to give disproportionate weight to trivial issues. For example, one department rep might insist that a special account was needed just for that department and wouldn't compromise. This caused other department reps to follow suit until they were all at a complete standstill. Since this problem was unlikely to resolve itself, I recommended that the project manager bring in the highest level project stakeholder that she could get to come in and talk to the group. The PM was quite resourceful, and she brought in the chancellor of the university to the very next meeting to talk with the group about the goals of the project and how it was time to put aside differences and work together strategically to create a new chart of accounts that had a usable, straightforward structure with enough flexibility to provide for future growth. The team took the hint and started making forward progress again almost immediately. By bringing the university chancellor in, the PM triggered the authority bias. This is the tendency to attribute greater accuracy to the opinion of an authority figure, unrelated to its content, and be more influenced by that opinion. The team took the chancellor's message to heart and started making the compromises needed to finish the project. This example illustrated how Parkinson's law of triviality can be mitigated by the authority bias. Now, let's look at another example where retention and recall are impacted by cognitive biases. There are many biases related to learning, retention, and recall. But in this example, we're going to talk about how the continued influence effect can impact learners. One of my colleagues found herself wasting a lot of time redoing a particular form each week. She'd been trained to fill out that form one way, and the form owner had recently corrected an error. My colleague needed to change an entry in a single field. That sounded easy enough, but she'd been doing that form each week for quite some time the same way, and her entries were basically automatic. She now found herself making the wrong entry in that corrected field, but not realizing her mistake until after she submitted the form. She'd even submitted the form in error twice some weeks because she got distracted at just the wrong time. She was bemoaning her problem at lunch one day, and I let her know that she was experiencing the continued influence effect. This is the tendency to believe previously learned misinformation even after it's been corrected. She asked me how she could break her pattern and stop filling out multiple forms each week. I suggested trying to use the humor effect to get out of her rut. The humor effect says that humorous items are more easily remembered than non-humorous ones. To apply this, she just needed to think of a funny story or joke or a silly song about that field on her form and repeat it in her head as often as she could over the next week. She was happy to report when I saw her next that she had correctly filled out her form the next week and that multiple form submissions were finally a thing of the past. This example illustrated how the continued influence effect can be mitigated by the humor effect. To examine our final learning goal of critical thinking and problem solving, let's take a look actually at ourselves as educators or trainers. It can be all too easy to fall into a rut with our own critical thinking or problem solving. Let's look at the law of the instrument. This bias means that we may be over-reliant on a familiar tool or method, thereby ignoring or undervaluing alternative approaches. The saying for this bias goes, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Like with all heuristics, it's easy to just take the mental shortcut and do it that way. But as we've shown, that's not always helpful. Consider these questions. Do you always use PowerPoint presentations for training? Are you so comfortable building your slides and presenting them that you haven't considered blended learning? Have you considered that e-learning, video, or performance support may be of more value to your learners in some situations? It could be time to do an audit of your instruments to see if you're over-reliant on one tool to the point of detriment. If you do find yourself stuck in a training rut, the Zeigarnik effect is one cognitive bias you may want to employ to counteract the law of the instrument. The Zeigarnik effect tells us that uncompleted or interrupted tasks are remembered better than completed ones. You're probably wondering how that bias could possibly help you mitigate the law of the instrument. Well, the Zeigarnik effect can help you to experiment with new tools and methods by giving you permission not only to fail, but also to move on to the next thing as soon as you realize it. You can use this to your advantage by running quick tests, experiments, or performances and interrupting them before their natural conclusion. The details of each of these happenings will be more accurately remembered, which will allow you to make more comparisons, will allow you to compare your results more easily. You can then bring your most successful experiments back into the classroom or incorporate it into your e-learning to quickly help both you and your learners break patterns and climb out of these training ruts. This leads me to our last topic in this section about how cognitive biases impact learning. Okay, now that you've learned about some examples of cognitive biases, I'd like you to do one last poll. Which of these biases have you encountered most often in your work? The status quo bias, which is the tendency to want things to stay relatively the same. The law of the instrument, which is the overuse of a tool to the detriment of the rest of the work. The IKEA effect, the tendency to put a disproportionately high value on that which you've assembled yourself. Or the continued influence effect, which is the tendency to believe previously learned misinformation even after it's been corrected. I'll give you just a minute to finish voting. So it looks like 67% of you chose the status quo bias, and it looks like there's some prevalence with both IKEA effect and law of the instrument. That's not surprising. The status quo bias is one of the most common biases that you'll encounter, both positively and negatively. A few of you said law of the instrument as well as continued influence effect, and I'm sure as you become more familiar with these cognitive biases, you'll see them all much more commonly in your work. It's really unavoidable. They'll start to show their face everywhere you look, honestly. Now, how do you make biases work for you? Simply put, biases exist and can undermine learning, but they can also work for you. First, we need to recognize bias in ourselves and in others. Then we can learn how to trigger more helpful biases. Today, we went through 4 biases that can be triggered to mitigate negative biases that can undermine our 4 learning goals of behavior change, performance improvement, retention and recall, or critical thinking and problem solving. The positive biases we used were the IKEA effect, the authority bias, the humor effect, and the Zeigarnik effect. But there are many more that we can choose from. To help you become familiar with the various cognitive biases that can undermine our 4 learning goals, and also the biases that can be used to mitigate those negative impacts, we've developed a set of 40 cognitive bias cards, color-coded by learning goal. For each of the 4 learning goals, you'll find 10 cards that impact that learning goal. The full set of the cognitive bias cards will be available for you to download at the end of this webinar, so you can work on identifying additional biases that specifically affect learning. In the meantime, here are a few more biases that you as educators and trainers can trigger. First is the context effect. The context effect tells you that we remember things better in the same context where we originally learned the information. If you have the opportunity to teach or train in the place where learners will actually be applying that knowledge, take it. They'll retain what you teach them so much better because they are in the space where they will apply the knowledge. The self-serving bias. Why do we acknowledge the achievements of students as they're learning? Why do gold stars matter? Because learners love a boost of self-esteem, and showing that they're doing well is a social bias that bolsters their desire to continue learning. Finally, the picture superiority effect. Images and pictures are always more memorable than words alone, so be sure to include them in your presentations and your lessons, but be sure to choose them carefully. They're very powerful tools. In conclusion, let me summarize. Cognitive biases color every part of our lives. They come from mental shortcuts that are meant to help us, but can backfire at times. Biases can be both helpful and harmful. It's important to learn to recognize common biases in ourselves and in others in order to break out of the bias as needed. We can avoid some of the negative effects of cognitive biases by triggering other biases that can have a positive impact on the situation. I'd like to issue you all a challenge. Once you've drafted your next set of course materials or storyboards, take some time to review the cognitive bias cards we'll provide at the conclusion of this webinar and identify any of those biases that may impact your learners negatively. Then, try to employ another more positive bias to mitigate the effect of the negative bias. Once you've completed that challenge, we would love to hear back from you about your experiences. As I mentioned, if you'd like to download your free set of 40 cognitive bias cards, go to www.dashe.com, that's D-A-S-H-E, and see our resources tab in the navigation menu. We'll also send out a direct link to download after we end our session today. Dashe has developed similar sets of cards related to other topics in the past, and they have proven to be very useful. The cognitive bias cards will allow you to become familiar with biases in each of the 4 areas of learning, so you can learn how to identify and address them. And you can mix and match cognitive biases that negatively impact learning with mitigating biases. With these cards in hand, you'll be well on your way to using cognitive biases to your advantage. And with that, we've come to the end of the formal presentation today, but we still have some time available to answer a few questions. If you have a question that you've not submitted yet, please do that now. And it looks like we have approximately 8 or 10 minutes to answer a few questions, and Sarah will help us facilitate those. So sure, make sure to submit those.
The first one came through throughout the actual last poll and says, how about the bias of selecting the first answers you see in multiple choice?
Yes, that's definitely one that's out there. I think, I'm not sure if it's classified exactly as a bias, but it's certainly something that is been measured and proven to happen
sure,
on a regular basis.
The second one is, if there are 188 biases, when do we develop those during our life? Childhood?
Yes, well, we develop them throughout our lives. You can develop new biases at any time, but they do start in childhood. The most common ones tend to start, as early as, 3, 4 years old, and they continue to develop and strengthen throughout our lifetimes. Depending on the experiences you have. Not everyone will develop all 188 that they've identified. Some people will, others, may have a subset of that. But it's kind of a constant process of developing new ones, reinforcing old ones. And every once in a while, you can break out of a bias that you have and learn to mitigate it yourself.
Great. Are there other well-known positive, negative pairs of biases that counteract one another?
This is a topic that I kind of came up with as I was studying all of these biases. I just find them fascinating. I haven't actually seen anywhere that they've been paired up in this way, where we've seen one bias counteracting another. So that doesn't mean it doesn't exist out there. I just haven't seen it in the research I've done so far. So perhaps this is a new way to look at biases.
Is there a bias about seeing a heading and thinking you already know about the topic?
Absolutely. The name of that bias is escaping me, but there is certainly a bias that basically says it's the verbatim effect, I believe, is the one we're looking at. And that's pretty much saying you can remember the things you can remember details based on, just a small amount of information to sort of trigger that memory. I think that's what's happening there, but there is certainly a bias that covers that.
And then what's the most important bias to learn, in your opinion?
I think for trainers, that status quo bias is a huge one. That comes up just all the time. People just don't like to change, and that's human nature. So our awareness of that is really important. And then I think on the other side of that coin, it's really important for us as trainers to be able to use the humor effect. And there's a related one called the bizarreness effect that can come in really handy for mitigating some of those biases in classes. And both of those are just using humor or using weird and strange stories to make things more easily remembered by your learners. And those can be really helpful to know as a trainer.
And then, is this a growing list of cognitive biases, or do you think we'll stay at the 188?
Well, depending on the source, some say they're less than 188 currently. Others, as there's a lot of overlap on that list. But in any case, I do think they will continue to identify new biases for some time at least. I don't think they've really identified all of them. It's probably slowed down since this study of cognitive biases started in the last century. I think it'll grow a little bit, yes.
And then the last one, I'm working on a training program and applying some of the beneficial biases to its development. I think that would be valuable. How have you approached doing that in your experience?
Well, there's really two ways to approach this. You can review your material while keeping in mind everything you know about your audience in order to identify potential trouble spots where cognitive bias may interfere with learning. From there, you can figure out the best way to mitigate the impact of those biases. On the other side of that coin, you can review your material from the perspective of wanting to make sure that certain topics have maximum impact on your learners. You can identify those points you want to make sure stay with your learners, and then look through your list of biases, particularly the positive ones, and apply those to the material as needed.
Great. And then I saw an infographic that listed a bias called cursive knowledge bias, when well-informed people are unable to look at an issue from the perspective of a less informed person. Is this a bias on the part of the SME or instructional designers?
Well, it can be both. We typically see that in the subject matter experts. And it's our job as an instructional designer to be that translator between the SME and the learner that sort of mitigates that bias. Just our presence mitigates that bias. We can take the information the SME is giving us and, bring it down to the level where the learners need it to be to effectively take that in.
And who is engaging in bias research right now? Are there articles or other resources out there?
There are a ton of articles and resources and research papers and all sorts of things out there right now. There are a number of cognitive scientists and neurologists and other folks out there that are researching this. A Google search, honestly, is a great place to start, and you will get more than you probably will be ever to get through in your lifetime.
Perfect. And we've had a couple questions about requesting the slide deck and a copy of the presentation as well as the download cards. So as a reminder, we will be emailing that out to all of you, all registrants of the webinar after the seminar today. And also, if you want to go to our website, you can see those cards right away, and that's www.dashe.com under the resources panel. Perfect. And just as a headline here, we have a couple of other exciting events coming up for Dash and Thompson in October. Our next webinar from our Best Practices series is going to be focused on design thinking, and that will be held on October 16th. Registration for this webinar is now available on our website. And then we will also be in Las Vegas exhibiting at DevLearn at the end of October. If you're attending the conference, please swing by the booth and say hi. We'll be at booth 724. And then, as always, we are happy to talk with you about your projects and learning. As a quick reminder, we're a full-service learning and development consulting firm that specializes in custom training solutions and change management. All my contact information is there on the screen, and as I mentioned, we'll be following up with you individually after today as well. But happy to talk with you, connect with you, and see how we can help with your current initiatives. With that, we'll sign off for the day. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful rest of your week.